As Washington turns up the maximum pressure on Iran, Tehran deepens its partnership with Beijing. On Tuesday, the last day of 2019, Chinese State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi met for a fourth time in the year with his Iranian counterpart Mohammed Jawad Zarif. They reiterated their desire to uphold multilateralism and strengthen cooperation to implement the Iran nuclear deal. As for the renewed tensions in the Persian Gulf, Wang Yi said the root cause was the U.S.'s May 2018 withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal and President Trump's decision to reimpose sanctions on Iran. So where will this nuclear standoff go in 2020, and what's bringing China and Iran closer? Joining me for the discussion here in Beijing is Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization, and from Iran, Professor Mohammed Marandi of the University of Tehran. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
On Tuesday, while hosting Foreign Minister Zarif in Beijing, Wang Yi said the U.S. should be responsible for the current tensions surrounding the nuclear deal. Now he said this, he said important changes are taking place on the Iranian nuclear issue. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran nuclear deal, is facing serious challenges. The fact that the United States unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA, abandoned its international obligations and put extreme pressure on Iran is the root cause of the tense situation on Iran's nuclear issue at present. Professor Marandi, what is your take of Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's assessment of the situation, and exactly how serious is the situation concerning the future of the Iran nuclear deal?
I think he's absolutely correct. The problem lies with the United States and the Europeans. The United States tore the agreement, and it's in full violation, and the Europeans are abiding by Trump's demands, and therefore they too are in non-compliance. They are violating all of the 11 commitments that they have completely, and they even prevent Iran from importing vital medicine from companies based in Europe or the United States. The Iranians, on the other hand, despite the U.S. withdrawal and the non-compliance compliance of the Europeans, they remained within the nuclear deal for well over a year. They were in full compliance, and only recently, in recent months, have the Iranians decreased their commitments gradually in order to put pressure on the Europeans to start implementing the deal. So the Iranians are still abiding by most of their commitments in the deal, and they're only decreasing their commitments to put pressure on the other side. So I think the statement of Chinese officials, as well as officials in Russia and many other countries, reflect the fact that despite the enormous power of the Western media, it is universally recognized that Western countries are creating or manufacturing a major problem, whereas the Iranians are attempting to contain this problem that the Europeans and the Americans have created.
Victor, what do you see as the reason behind the utterance of such a very strong position from the Chinese Foreign Minister? Is it something new? Is this a continuation of China's stance all along, or is he sending a rather nuanced but stronger message?
Well, first of all, I think the Chinese government's position on the Iranian situation has been consistent. China has been very impartial, very objective, very realistic. And I would say until the United States pulled out of this very important Iran deal, there was real hope that nuclearization would be halted and sanctions would be lifted and peace and stability would be restored to Iran and its neighboring region. This would be a very important breakthrough, and also this would be highly welcomed by countries and peoples in that particular region. Now, I think with the United States withdrawal from this very important Iran deal by violating its international obligations, the United States really has created all the new problem. So I think Foreign Minister Wang Yi is very objective and very realistic in his assessment of the situation to start with. Now, going forward, I think it is really very, very dangerous for the situation involving Iran to deteriorate. And it wouldn't be that difficult to imagine that the situation may go even beyond the point of no return, and eventually there will be lots of sufferings in Iran, in the neighboring region, and also for the United States. So it is time to call on the United States to restore its own senses and rationality rather than going jingoistic in dealing with such an important country of Iran and such an important issue of nuclearization in Iran.
Yeah, well, he said that China supports all kinds of constructive efforts to ease tensions and uphold the deal, and hope that all relevant parties will effectively implement the deal by sticking to the right path, standing up to external pressure and settle differences through talks. Professor Marandi, do you see any possibility in 2020 for the situation to turn around, to improve slightly, even just a little bit, or for the talks, for any talks to resume in the year 2020?
Well, that's really difficult to say at this stage. I don't foresee any major shift in U.S. policy or the U.S. returning to the nuclear deal as we speak. And that is, of course, a precondition for the Iranians for any further negotiations. The Iranians are saying that the Americans must abide by their current commitments in order for any discussions to take place to talk about anything else. Because when the Americans are violating what they've committed themselves already to do, then what's the point of talking about anything else when we will never know, or we will never be able to trust the Americans to carry out further commitments? But I think the situation in the region is evolving in a way in which the Americans are going to be under increased pressure. What we saw, for example, in Iraq in the last few days was a major blow to the United States. The Americans carried out an illegal strike, murdering tens of Iraqi soldiers who were fighting against ISIS. They thought they could act with impunity in Iraq. And the Iraqi people, many of them allies of Iran, friendly to Iran, they turned the tables on the United States. They shut down the embassy, basically. And now the Americans suddenly recognize that their foothold in Iraq is much weaker than they thought. The same is true in Syria. The Americans were defeated. Their support for extremist groups. In Yemen, the Americans and the Saudis also failed. So the Americans are facing major difficulties across the region. And they're beginning to recognize that their foothold is much weaker than they had previously assessed. So I think that is going to be a strong point for Iran and its allies. And these are not proxies of Iran. These are allies of Iran that exist across the region, in Afghanistan and elsewhere. So this is something that the Americans are going to have to take into consideration in the coming months. And we already see that the tone of American politicians has changed. They were speaking with impunity and arrogance after the airstrike, but after Iraqi protesters went to the embassy and after hundreds of thousands of people took part in the funerals of the murdered soldiers, we saw that the Americans changed their tone. American officials spoke with greater humility, and it showed that that the Americans understood that their position is not all that great.
Victor, what is your take on the same question, the kind of possibility or the prospect of how the situation would develop for America, of course, for Iran as well, which is a very important country in the region?
Personally, I'm very pessimistic about the prospect of the Iranian situation or the Middle East situation in general. Why? Because I don't think it is realistic to expect that President Donald Trump of the United States will make a sudden change of mind. I think the stalemate between the United States and Iran will continue. Probably it will get worse before it gets better. But fundamentally, I think there is only one way out of this mess. That is peace and negotiation and diplomacy. Because if anyone or any side is really thinking about pulling pulling the trigger one way or another, the consequences for either the United States or Iran will be much worse than whatever the status quo right now. So it is time to use diplomacy, and I think Foreign Minister Wang Yi of China is doing exactly the right thing to call on all parties to exercise their rationality and go back to the negotiation table rather than bluffing, for example, or bombing, pulling trigger in all directions, causing more casualties. And otherwise, I'm afraid 2020 will see much worse situation in the Middle East.
Let's take a look at the bilateral relationship between China and Iran in 2020. Now, during the Wang Yi-Zarif meeting in Beijing, China and Iran also agreed to consolidate the so-called political mutual trust and pragmatic cooperation arrangement between the two sides. But the Trump administration has implemented what it says were the toughest ever sanctions against Iran, prohibiting countries and companies from doing business with the U.S. if they trade or deal with Iran. And it said that according to figures, the sanctions are apparently hurting China's business relationship with Iran. So, Professor Marandi, how do you look at the possibility of China and the necessity as well of China and Iran increasing their cooperation and the scope of cooperation for the two sides in 2020?
Well, the situation is difficult, and the Americans are waging economic warfare against Iran, although, as I said, the Americans are losing ground across the region as a result of their conflict with Iran. And but Iran and China are moving closer to each other because both of them are facing irrational pressure from the United States. The Americans are engaging in economic warfare against ordinary Iranians, and they're also engaging in a trade war with China, which is being unfairly conducted by Washington. So this is itself an incentive. Iran is also the most important power in the region with great regional influence, and China, of course, is an economic powerhouse and an economic superpower. But I think that what we are seeing, though, despite the difficulties, is a new trend. Right now, the Iranians have removed the need for Chinese citizens to have visas. So now Chinese citizens can travel to Iran without obtaining a visa. We are seeing a rise in the number of Chinese who visit Iran this year. And in addition, we also see a new trend that's just beginning, where small businesses and medium-sized businesses in China, their business people, their CEOs are traveling to Iran, especially businesses that don't have international branches, and they are exploring new opportunities in the country. So there is a new trend taking place between the two countries, and it is rather optimistic in many ways.
All right. Victor, 30 seconds, please. How do you look at the kind of relationship that is being strengthened between China and Iran out of convenience, out of necessity, or out of genuine goodwill and opportunity?
I think more importantly, this is a relationship out of principled positions of China. Why? Because China has consistently, over the decades, treated Iran as an equal with mutual respect, and China fully understands its geopolitical difficulties, and China is firmly opposed to unilateralism. That's the key. In the world of today, if unilateralism prevails, all of us are going to suffer, and we need to really promote multilateralism as the key megatrend of the world going forward, rather than being held hostage by self-imposing unilateralism.
Well, thank you very much. We are going to leave it. That time is up. But good news that for many Chinese, we don't need visas anymore to go to Tehran. So that's good news. I hope more people will go and explore that fantastic and mesmerizing country. Many thanks to my guest, Professor Mohammed Marandi, joining us from Tehran, and many thanks to Victor Gao for joining us here in the Beijing studio. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.